Hello there, and welcome to The Sleepy Historian, a quiet corner where the past drifts in softly and forgotten worlds return as gentle stories for the night. Tonight, we'll be wandering into why Viking homes never froze, even in Arctic winters, and a few other quiet stories from distant places where people learned, in their own careful ways, how to live gently inside difficult worlds. But before you settle in, if you truly enjoy these calm journeys through history, you're welcome to like this video and subscribe, only if it feels right for you. And when you're ready, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always a quiet joy to see how many places and moments gather here together. Now dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and then let's slowly step into the past, softly, gently, together. Tonight you are not standing in a library or a museum. You are standing outside in a northern winter, where the air feels thin and quiet, and the land stretches away in pale blues and soft greys. The sun has only just risen, and already it is thinking about leaving again. Snow lies in long, patient folds across the ground, shaped by wind that never quite rests. At first, it might seem impossible that anyone could live here comfortably. The cold presses against your face like a careful hand. The horizon feels distant and empty. Even sound moves differently in weather like this, somewhat slower, as though it too prefers to stay close to warm. And yet, not far ahead, there is a house. It does not look like what you might expect. It is not tall. It is not proud. It does not rise above the landscape. Instead, it seems to settle into it as if the earth itself has gently folded around its sides. The roof is thick with grass that has turned pale and quiet for the season. Snow rests along its surface but does not threaten it. Inside that house, people are warm, not perfectly warm, not luxuriously warm, but warm enough to cook, to sleep, to speak quietly with one another while winter waits outside the walls. And the surprising thing is this: they are not surviving the cold by strength alone, they are surviving it by design. This is the secret you begin to notice as you step closer. Viking homes did not stay warm because their builders were tougher than other people. They stayed warm because they were shaped with patience, observation, and a deep familiarity with wind, soil, animals, and fire. In many ways, the story of these houses is not really about winter at all. It is about how people learn to live beside difficulty without trying to defeat it. And once you begin to notice that pattern, you start to see it elsewhere too. Far away in another part of the world, a group of former retainers once nearly waited 2 years before taking a single step toward revenge, choosing patience instead of anger. In medieval Europe, armored riders gathered in carefully organized tournaments where violence followed rules as strict as ceremony. And in crowded towns filled with narrow streets and wooden doors, warm bathhouses offered steam, conversation, and a quiet way of keeping illness at a distance before it arrived. These are not separate stories, they are small examples of the same gentle truth. For most people in the past, the survival did not depend on heroic endurance. It depends on systems that quietly protect everyday life. Tonight you begin with a house that refuses to freeze. You are walking now across ground that does not feel quite like ground in the way you are used to. It is firm but also layered, packed by old snow beneath new snow, and beneath that by soil that has been cold for longer than anyone can remember nearby. Each step makes only a small sound, as though the land prefers quiet during winter. The air is clear enough that distant shapes appear closer than they truly are. A low ridge of earth ahead might be a hill, or it might be something else entirely. As you move closer, the shape becomes clearer. It is a house, although at first it hardly looks like one. Its walls do not rise sharply from the ground. Instead, they seem to grow out of it. The roof sits low and steady, covered in grass that has turned the color of faded straw. Snow gathers along its surface, but does not slide away. It rests there like an extra blanket. If you are expecting tall wooden walls and wide windows, you will not find them here. This house is not trying to stand above winter. It is trying to disappear into it. Long before anyone inside lit a fire, warmth had already begun its quiet work here. The builders of houses like this understood something simple but powerful. Heat escapes upward, wind steals it sideways. Open space invites it away. So instead of building high and open structures that challenge the cold, they build low ones that ignore it. Two archaeological reconstructions from the National Museum of Denmark show that many Viking longhouses were shaped with this idea in mind from the very beginning. Their walls were thick, their roofs heavy, and their floors sometimes set slightly below the surrounding ground. This was not decorated, it was prepared. By lowering the house into the earth even a little, the builders allow the soil itself to help protect them. Underground layers change temperature slowly. They do not react quickly to wind, they hold yesterday's warmth a little longer than open air does. So the house borrowed that steadiness. You might not notice it at first, but the doorway is also carefully placed. It does not face the direction from which the strongest winter winds usually arrive. Instead, it turned slightly aside, as though politely refused the cold's invitation to enter. These choices were not dramatic ones. They did not require special tools or rare materials. They require attention. Nearby, a man named Einar kneels beside a shallow trench where the edge of the wall will soon stand. He pressed his hand into the soil, testing its firmness. Around him lie cut rectangles of turf, each lifted carefully from the ground earlier that morning. Their roots still hold the earth together. When stacked, they will form walls thick enough to slow the movement of air and keep warm close. He does not hurry. There is no reason to hurry. A house like this is not built in a single afternoon. It is built in layers, each one quiet and deliberate. Above him, the winter sun lifts itself only a short distance above the horizon. It will never climb very high today. Instead, it moves sideways across the sky like a pale coin sliding along the edge of a table. Even this brief light matters. It helps mark time, it helps guide work. And it reminds everyone nearby that winter is not endless, only patient. When the house is finished, its shape will continue to guide the wind over its roof rather than letting the wind press against its sides. Snow will gather along its edges instead of forcing its way through its walls. The ground beneath it will hold a memory of yesterday's warmth, passing that memory slowly upward through the floor. All of this will happen quietly. No single part of the house will feel remarkable on its own, but together they will create something stronger than any one fire could provide. And the most surprising part of all is that the deepest warmth of the longhouse does not begin in the hearth at its center. It begins in the earth beneath your feet. Outside, the ground was already stiff with frost when Einar began cutting the turf. He didn't rush the work. No one ever did. A turf block had to be shaped slowly, pressed free from the frozen soil with patience rather than force. The blade entered the earth with a dull resistance, then paused, then moved again. Each cut followed a line already suggested by the land itself. The block lifted heavy and dark, still smelling faintly of roots and cold moisture, like something that had been sleeping beneath the surface for a long time. He turned it once in his hands before stacking it with the others. Piece by piece, house rose not upward into the wind, but downward into the quiet protection of the earth. To modern eyes, a house that sinks into the ground might look unfinished or even fragile. But for Viking families living through northern winters, lowering the floor beneath the surface was not a compromise. It was the beginning of warmth. The deeper the house settled into the soil, the less it belongs to the weather above it. Even when winter air drifted far below freezing, the earth only a short distance beneath the surface held a steadier memory of summer. It did not grow warm exactly, but it refused to grow truly cold. Instead, it stayed calm, holding its temperature somewhere between the extremes of the seasons, like a quiet storage place for forgotten sunlight. By resting the floor inside this stable layer of ground, the house borrowed that calmness. Cold winds could sweep across the open landscape all night without reaching the deeper soil below. Frost could thicken across fields and rivers while the earth remained quietly unchanged. Inside the half-sunken structure, that steadiness surrounds the living space from below, supporting warmth in a way that no raised wooden floor ever could. The house was not simply standing on the land, it was taking into it. This small shift makes another difference as well. A house that rose high above the ground had to face the full strength of winter winds, but a house that settled lower presented less surface for the wind to strike. Storms moved across its roof rather than directly against its walls. Air flowed over it instead of pressing against it. From a distance, our turf house almost disappeared into the slope where it stood. And that disappearance was intentional. Winter storms in the north rarely arrived gently. They moved across the open terrain with long, steady force, carrying needles of snow that searched for every crack in wood and fabric. But a low house offered few places for the wind to catch. Its shape guides the storm upward and away rather than letting it gather pressure along the walls. The building did not resist the weather. It allows the weather to pass over it. Soon, snow itself joined the quiet work of insulation. As storms returned again and again through the season, drifting snow gathered along the outer walls. At first, it formed shallow ridges, later deeper banks. Eventually, the house seemed to settle even further into the landscape as white layers built themselves carefully against its sides. To someone standing outside, the structure might appear almost buried. Inside, however, something else was happening. Snow, though cold to the touch, traps millions tiny pockets of still air within its layers, and still air holds warmer better than moving air ever can. As the snow thickened along the walls, it formed an additional shield around the house, slowing the escape of heat and softening the arrival of new cold. The winter that surrounded the house also began protecting it. In this way, snow became less an enemy than a companion. It completed the shelter the builders had already begun. It finished what turf alone had begun. The house did not endure winter alone. It worked together with it. During heavy storms, another change became noticeable. Outside, the wind could roar across the fields with a sound like distant water rushing over stone. Snow might strike the roof in steady waves, and loose ice could move across the ground in sharp whispers. Inside the turf walls, those sounds faded. The thick layers of soil and grass absorb vibration before it reaches the living space. The drifting snow outside softened echoes even further. What remained inside was not silent exactly, but something close to it. A gentler atmosphere where the storm still exists, yet no longer pressed directly against the senses. Families sitting near the central fire could hear the weather moving above them, but only faintly, as if it belonged to another place. The house did not block the storm completely. It translated it into something quieter. Even the doorway took part in this careful design. Builders rarely placed entrances facing the direction from which winter winds most often arrived. Instead, they turned the doors slightly aside, allowing storms to slide past the opening rather than push directly through it. This small adjustment changed how cold air entered the house. Wind slowed before reaching the threshold. Snow gathered beside the entrance rather than inside it. A visitor stepping through the doorway might never notice the difference, but the people who lived there certainly did. Over many winters, these quiet decisions shaped how warm stayed inside the house. The lowered floor held steady ground temperature beneath it. The turf walls absorbed shifting air. The snow deepened its protection from outside. Even the doorway guided storms gently away. Or none of these changes seemed dramatic on their own. Together they formed a shelter that worked with the land instead of against it. And yet the walls themselves were only the beginning of the house's quiet defense. On a morning when the frost still clung to the edges of the doorway, Sigrid knelt beside the timber frame with a bundle of dark moss gathered from the edge of a nearby stream. She didn't press it into the wall quickly. Each strip had to be folded carefully between the wooden beams, tucked into narrow seams where cold air might otherwise slip through unnoticed. Her fingers moved slowly, testing the softness of the moss before placing it. Some pieces were thicker, some more fragile, and each found its place only after she turned it once or twice in her hands. From the outside, the wall already looks complete, but Sigrid knew better. Warmth did not come from timber alone. It came from what filled the space between. The wooden frame of a Viking house formed its shape, but it did not form its protection. That work belongs to layers that followed. Earth, moss, bark, and turf were pressed together one after another until the wall became something closer to a living surface than a simple boundary. The first layer often begins with birch bark. Birch trees grew widely across the northern landscape, and their bark carried a quiet usefulness that builders trusted. It bends without breaking, it resists moisture, it can be peeled in broad sheets and laid flat between timber and soil like a protective skin. Once pressed into place, it slows the movement of dampness from the outside world toward the interior structure. The house did not simply block rain, it guided moisture away before it could settle. Over the bark came packed earth. This soil was not thrown loosely against the frame. It was shaped by hand, pressed firmly so that fewer gaps remained inside it. The builders understood, even without describing it in modern terms, that still material holds warmer than shifting air. A tightly packed wall kept winter drafts from traveling easily through it. Each handful of earth added weight, but it also added steadiness. Gradually the wall thickened. It began to resemble something less like carpentry and more like landscape. Then came the moss. At first glance, moss seems too soft to protect anything. It grows quietly along stones and falling branches. It can be lifted easily from the ground. It dries quickly in the sun. When I get inside the seams of a timber wall, moss performed one of the most important tasks of all. It is filled with what could not be seen. Air rarely entered a Viking house through large openings. Instead, it slipped through hair-thin spaces between wood and soil. Moss answered those spaces patiently. Pressed between beams, it formed a flexible barrier that shifted slightly with the seasons, but never disappeared. And when winter deepened, something else happened. As the air grew colder and drier, the moss itself tightened. Its fibers shrank almost imperceptibly, drawing closer together and sealing the seams more firmly than before. Openings that might have allowed drifting air in autumn closed quietly as frost strengthened its grip on the landscape. The wall adjusts itself without tools, without noise. and without instruction, listened to the season. Above these layers, turf blocks complete the structure. Each block carried with it a thin covering of grass roots that held the soil together even after it had been lifted from the ground. When stacked across the outer frame, these blocks overlapped like folded blankets carefully laid one on top of another. Their weight pressed downward and inward at the same time, strengthening the wall while also thickening its insulation. In winter, the roots inside the turf stiffened with frost, locking the layers more securely together. In warmer months, they softened again, allowing the structure to breathe without losing its shape. The wall was never entirely rigid. It changed slowly with the seasons, just as the landscape around it did. Inside the house, this layered construction creates a different kind of atmosphere. Cold air that passes easily through a thin wooden barrier could not travel as freely through soil, moss, bark, and turf combined. Instead, it slowed down, it weakened, it lost its sharpness before reaching the interior space. Warmth from the central hearth lingered longer. Heat from sleeping bodies stayed closer to the benches along the walls. Even small movements of air became quieter as they passed through the thick surfaces surrounding the room. The house did not trap warmth suddenly. It held it gently, the way a mouth holds breath before speaking. Over time, smoke from the hearth added another invisible layer of protection. As it drifted upward through the rafters and along the interior surfaces, it carried tiny particles of soot that settled slowly into the upper seams of the structure. These particles darkened the beams and filled microscopic openings in the roof and walls alike. What began as smoke became sealant. Generation after generation, the rafters above the heart grew darker, smoother, and more resistant to drafts. The house remembers each winter it survived. Its surfaces recorded those seasons quietly in layers no one needed to measure. Builders may not have described this process in technical language, but archaeological reconstructions of turf walls across Scandinavia have shown how these materials work together as a single system. Timber gave shape. Birch bark resisted moisture. Moss sealed narrow seams. Earth thickened the barrier. Turf completed the insulation. No single layer carries the burden alone. Warmth depends on their cooperation. Inside such walls, families lived through winters that lasted longer than modern seasons often suggest. Nights stretched across many hours of darkness. Winds crossed open fields without interruption. Snow returned again and again, covering paths that had only recently been cleared, yet inside the longhouse the layered walls answered that persistence with their own quiet patience. They did not resist the cold with force, they absorbed it, slowed it, and guided it away. And still, even these careful walls were not the only source of warmth inside the house. The children noticed the smoke first. It gathered slowly beneath the rafters, not in a sudden cloud, but in a soft grey layer that drifted upward and settled there as though it had found a place it preferred to remain. They watched it move along the beams, with thinning and thickening as the fire shifted below, always present but never overwhelming. To someone unfamiliar with a Viking longhouse, this lingering smoke might seem like a flaw. Inside the house, it was part of the design. At the center of the room, the hearth burned steadily through most of the day and long into the night. It was not placed against a wall, and it did not feed its smoke into a chimney. Instead, the fire rested in the middle of the living space, surrounded by benches, tools, and quiet conversation. Its warmth spread outward in every direction at once, touching the walls, the floor, and the roof together. Above it, the smoke rose slowly toward the ceiling. But it did not leave immediately. The roof of a Viking house was not sealed in the way modern roofs are. Instead, It could allow smoke to escape gradually through small openings near the ridge. These gaps were narrow and indirect, just enough to release excess smoke without allowing heat to disappear too quickly into the winter air. The smoke stayed because it was meant to stay. As it gathered beneath the rafters, it formed a thin layer of warmer air high above the living space. This layer acts like a blanket suspended overhead. Heat that might otherwise have drifted upward and disappeared into the cold sky instead lingered within the house, circulating slowly before escaping. The roof did not simply release warmth, it held it for a while first. Over time, the smoke changed the structure itself. The beams above the hearth darkened gradually, season after season, until they carried a deep, smooth sheen that spoke quietly of many winters. As soot settled into small cracks and seams along the rafters, tiny openings where cold air might have slipped through became filled with these soft deposits, closing themselves almost without notice. The house adjusts itself through use. Each fire confirmed it. Experimental reconstructions of longhouses have shown that this slow accumulation of smoke particles helped reduce drafts in the upper structure of the building. Without tools or additional materials, the roof became tighter and more protective simply because people lived beneath it. Warmth rose, smoke followed, and the house learned how to keep both. There were other advantages to this drifting layer of smoke as well. The rafters above the hearth were rarely dry in winter. Moisture from snow, breath, and damp clothing could easily settle into wooden beams and weaken them over time. But smoke carries warmth and dryness upward with it. As it passed along the roof timbers, it slowly dried the wood, protecting it from rot. The smoke wasn't just hot, it was preservation. Bundles of fish, strips of meat, and wet clothing often hang from beams above the hearth. Suspended there in the rising warmth, they dried gradually through the long winter months. The process was slow and steady, never hurried. Food stored this way lasts longer, clothing returned to use more quickly. Even tools benefited from the dry air that gathered beneath the roof. The house turned its smoke into a quiet helper. It also discourages small intruders. Insects rarely settled in rafters that carried the scent of smoke. Parasites that might otherwise have hidden in bedding or timber avoid the upper reaches of the house. Over time, the lingering smoke creates an environment less welcoming to creatures that thrive in still, untreated wood. The warmth remained, the insects moved away. Children lying on the benches sometimes watched the smoke drift along the beams in slow patterns that changed with each movement of the fire below. When someone adds a new piece of wood to the hearth, the grey layer above will stir gently, shifting its shape without disappearing. The ceiling seemed alive with motion, yet it never hurried. Sound moved differently in that softened air. The crackle of burning wood reached the rafters and returned more quietly. Voices rose and settled again in a slower rhythm. Even the wind outside seemed to lose some of its sharpness before it could enter the room. The smoke changed how the house sounded. It softened winter. Over generations, the rafters recorded these seasons in their darkened surfaces. Saga descriptions and archaeological reconstructions both suggest that longhouses often carried this deep coloration long before they were rebuilt or repaired. The beams themselves became a memory of repeated fires, repeated winters, and repeated gatherings around the same central warmth. The roof reminds what the people below it needed, and it answered. Visitors from outside might have expected smoke to make the house uncomfortable. Instead, they often find that the air near the benches remains clear enough for conversation, work, and rest. The smoke stayed mostly above head height, drifting where it could do its work without interfering with daily life below. It was present, but it was patient. The hearth itself is rarely burned with sudden intensity. Instead, it maintains a steady glow that could last through the night with only occasional tending. Embers remained alive beneath ash, ready to brighten again when morning arrived. This constancy allows warmth to remain inside the house even during the longest hours of darkness. The fire did not sleep completely, neither did the house. In this way, smoke became part of the structure's quiet defense against winter. It sealed openings, dried timbers, preserved food, softened sound, and held warmth where it was most needed. It did not leave quickly because it was not meant to leave quickly. It belonged there. And even the animals inside the house had a role to play in the quiet work of warmth. When night settled across the valley and the last light faded from the doorway, Sigrid prepared the sleeping places along the walls. She did not lie down directly on the floor. No one did. Instead, she climbed onto the raised wooden platform that ran the length of the longhouse interior, its surface already layered with folded textiles and carefully arranged furs. One by one, she guided the children into their places beside her, drawing coverings slowly across their shoulders until only their breathing disturbed the quiet air above the benches. The cold remained below. Sleep belonged to higher up. These raised platforms were not simply places to rest, they were part of the house's careful design against winter. Cold air, heavier than warm air, settled naturally toward the floor during the night. By lifting their sleeping spaces above that colder layer, families rested where warmth remains longer and steadier. And without needing to explain the physics in words, they understood the pattern through experience. Higher meant upgrading. The difference was not dramatic, but it was enough to matter. A few handspans of separated elevation, a restless night from a comfortable one. Over the course of a long winter, that difference became part of survival itself. Along the walls, these platforms also received another advantage. The thick turf structure surrounding the house stored heat slowly throughout the day as the hearth burned nearby. By evening, the inner surfaces of the walls released that stored warmth back into the room in small amounts. Sleeping close to them was meant to be resting beside a surface that had quietly noticed the fire. The walls did not only protect, they returned warm after holding it. Before settling fully for the night, Sigrid spread additional layers across the bedding. Wool cloth came first. Wool had a particular quality that northern families relied on deeply. Even when slightly damp, it still holds warmth close to the body. Its fibers trapped still air between them, creating a soft barrier against the cold that moves slowly through the room after sunset. Over the wool came the heaviest coverings. Animal furs formed the final layer. She arranged them carefully so that their edges overlapped, leaving no open seams between them. The children shifted slightly as she worked, adjusting themselves into the softness of the layered bedding. Soon their movements slowed, and their breathing settled into a quieter rhythm. Warmth did not arrive suddenly. It gathered gradually between the layers. These shared sleeping spaces were rarely used by only one person. Families rested together along the platforms, sometimes several children beneath the same covering, sometimes elders nearby, sometimes visiting relatives included for a season or longer. The closeness was not only practical, it was expected. Shared warmth was stronger than solitary warmth. Through the night, each sleeping body contributes a small amount of heat to the space around it. Alone, that warmth would have faded quickly. Together, it lingered beneath the coverings, building slowly until the bedding itself seemed to hold it in place. The house gathers warmth from many small sources at once, Even the arrangement of cloth around the sleeping spaces helped protect this quiet comfort. Linen curtains sometimes hang around the edges of the platforms, forming simple enclosures that slow the movement of air during the coldest hours before dawn. These curtains did not seal the sleepers away completely. Instead, they softened the passage of drafts that might otherwise have slipped across uncovered skin. Air is still moving, but it moved more gently. Wall hangings served a similar purpose. Along the inner surfaces of the longhouse, woven textiles covered sections of timber and turf. Their patterns varied from house to house, but their function remains consistent. They created another thin layer between the living space and the outer structure, reducing the small movements of cold air that traveled slowly through the walls overnight. The house became quieter after these coverings were drawn into place, not silent, but softer. In this sheltered space above the floor, I arrived to sleep gradually. The last sounds of the hearth faded into steady embers. The smoke layer remains high beneath the rafters. Outside, the wind moves across the roof without disturbing those resting inside. Children sometimes listen to these distant sounds before drifting fully into sleep. The house did not remove winter entirely. It changed how winter reached them. It turned sharpness into distance. The platforms themselves were built with this purpose in mind from the beginning. They ran along both sides of the longhouse interior, leaving the central aisle open for movement during the day and for the glow of the hearth at night. Their position allows sleepers to remain close to the stored warmth of the walls while also facing the gentle light of the fire. Nothing inside the house was arranged by accident. Even rest followed the shape of warmth. Over time, these sleeping spaces became part of family memory. Children who once slept beneath shared furs later prepared the same coverings for their own household. The arrangement of benches, textiles, and curtains remains familiar across generations, not because tradition demanded it, but because it worked. Winter Mandarin each year. So did the platforms. And yet, even with wool, fur, curtains, and raised benches, the warmest part of the longhouse was not the bedding itself, but the people gathered together. Late at night, when the fire had settled into a quieter glow and the wind moved steadily across the roof above, Einar sometimes listened before sleep arrived. The sounds inside the house did not disappear after dark. They changed. Somewhere beyond the benches, a sheep shifts its weight softly against the wooden partition. A cow exhaled in a long, slow breath that rose briefly into the warmer air above its stall. Hooves pressed gently against packed earth. Straw rustled, then everything settled again. These were not interruptions, they were part of the warmth. In many Viking households, animals did not remain outside during winter. Instead, they shared the structure of the longhouse itself, separated from the family's living space by low wooden barriers, but close enough that their presence became part of the building's quiet balance. To modern expectations, this arrangement might seem unusual, yet for northern families facing long months of cold, it was entirely practical. Every living creature inside the house contributes heat, and even a single animal releases warmth slowly through breath and body. Several animals together create a steady source of gentle temperature support that lasted through the entire night. This warmth did not replace the hearth, it worked alongside it, strengthening the house's ability to remain comfortable during the coldest hours before morning. The house gathered heat the way it gathered people, carefully and without waste. The animals themselves benefited as well. Protected from wind and deep frost, they require less energy simply to remain alive through winter. Healthier livestock meant stronger families in spring. The arrangement supports both human survival and agricultural continuity at the same time, Warmth moved in both directions. In this way, the longhouse functions less like a building and more like a small ecosystem. Heat from the hearth rose towards the rafters. Warmth stored in the turf walls returned slowly into the room. Body heat from sleepers remains beneath layered coverings. Breath from animals drifted upward and joined the same shared air. Nothing inside the house stood alone. Each source supports the others. Even the entrances reflect this careful thinking. Doorways remained narrow, not because space was limited, but because wide openings allowed warmth to escape too quickly. A smaller entrance slows the movement of air between inside and outside. Each time someone clicked, the house lost less of the warmth it had gathered through the evening. The roof also contributed. Longhouses were built with relatively low interior ceilings compared to many later European structures. This was not a limitation of the material, and it was a deliberate decision. A lower roof allows rising warmth from the hearth and sleeping bodies to remain closer to the living space instead of drifting too far overhead before returning downward again. Heat stayed where people needed it. Above the rafters, turf layers continued their quiet work, holding warmth inside while resisting the pressure of winter winds. Snow gathered there as it had along the walls, completing the insulation from above just as it had from the sides. From outside, the house appeared nearly merged with the land. From inside, it feels steady and enclosed without becoming confined. The structure did not separate itself from its surroundings. It settled into them. During the deepest hours of night, when the fire burned lowest and conversation had long since faded, the house remained active in quieter ways. The turf walls released stored warmth slowly. The smoke layer beneath the rafters softened any remaining drafts. The animals shifted occasionally, their breathing steady and calm. Even the earth beneath the floor continues to hold its memory of summer's gentler temperatures, nothing hurried. Warmth remains because it moves slowly. Families resting along the benches did not need to think about these processes individually. They experienced them together as part of ordinary life. The house continuously worked in the background, responding to wind, snow, breath, and fire with a patience that required no adjustment once winter had begun. Shelter became routine rather than effort. Reconstructed Scandinavian farmhouses studied by archaeologists show how consistently these features appear across regions shaped by similar climates. Timber frames, turf insulation, shared animal space, low entrances, and compact interior volumes formed a pattern repeated again and again, not because of imitation alone, but because the arrangement proved reliable over generations. Experience shaped architecture. Architecture protected experience. Einar sometimes listened to the wind outside, striking the outer turf walls during these long winter nights. It didn't sound like an attack. It sounded distant, softened before it reached him. The house received the force of the storm long before it reached resting those inside. Between wind and sleeper stand layers of earth, wood, moss, breath, and memory. Together they formed something stronger than any single wall. The longhouse was never just a shelter. It was a shared environment shaped by people, animals, landscape, and season working quietly together across time. Every winter tested it. Every winter confirms it again. Warmth did not depend on strength alone. It depends on cooperation. And far away from the Arctic winds that shaped these northern houses, another kind of patience was unfolding in silence for almost 2 years. On a quiet morning in the shogun's capital, the corridors of Edo Castle were already awake with careful movement. Servants crossed polished floors in soft steps. Officials adjusted sleeves and documents. Courtiers paused before sliding doors, listening before entering. as though each room contained its own small gravity. In this place, behavior was never casual. Every gesture belongs to a language older than memory, and every mistake carries consequences that could not easily be undone. And among those moving through these corridors that morning was Asano Naganori. He had come, like many regional lords, to fulfill ceremonial duties required by the shogunate. These visits were not optional. They were part of the delicate structure that held the country together. Each lord traveled to the capital not only to show loyalty, but to demonstrate discipline, restraint, and understanding of courtly order. And nowhere was that order more important than inside the castle itself. Here, even the smallest action carries weight. The etiquette of the Edo court was precise enough to feel almost invisible. A sleeve held too loosely, a bow performed at the wrong angle, a voice raised half a breath too quickly. These things mattered. They shaped reputation long before words could correct them. To guide visiting lords through these expectations, the shogunate senior officials appointed whose task was instructed. One of them is Kira Yoshinaka. His role was not military, it was ceremonial. He taught protocol, supervised preparation, and assured that visiting daimyo performed their duties correctly before the shogun. In theory, his position demands patience and clarity. In practice, it often requires something more difficult, diplomacy between men already burdened with pride. For reasons that later records describe only in fragments, the relationship between Asano and Kira grew strained. Some said gifts expected by custom had not been delivered in proper form. Others suggested that tone alone creates the distance between them. No single explanation survives clearly. Instead, what remains is a sense of tension that deepened quietly over several days. At first, nothing visible changed. The corridors remained calm. The meetings continued. Then, on a spring day in the year 1701, something unexpected happened. Inside one of the castle's inner passageways, where weapons were strictly forbidden, Asano drew his sword. The motion itself was brief, a single step forward, a flash of steel, and then silence again. In that moment, the balance of the court shifted. Drawing a weapon inside Edo Castle was not merely improper, it was unthinkable. The castle represents the authority of the shogun himself. Violence within its walls threatens more than a single official. It threatens the structure of order on which the entire government depends. Kira survived the attack with only minor injuries, but the consequences for Asano were already certain. Before the day had ended, the judgment was announced. There would be no extended inquiry, no prolonged negotiation. The decision followed immediately from the act itself. Asano Naganori was ordered to perform seppuku. This form of death was not considered punishment alone. It was also recognition of status. A samurai permitted to end his own life in this way preserves a measure of dignity even while accepting responsibility. The ritual followed a structure as careful as the etiquette that had preceded the incident. Clothing was prepared, witnesses assembled, words spoken briefly without ornament. By the end of the day, the lord of Akko domain was gone. The speed of the decision leaves little time for reflection. News traveled outward from Edo, quietly but steadily. He carried along roads already familiar with official messages. By the time it reached the coastal lands of Akko domain, the consequences had already begun unfolding. The domain itself was dissolved, its lands were reassigned, its administration has ended, and its retainers were dismissed. Samurai who had served Asano all their lives suddenly found themselves without a lord. Armor once carefully maintained for duty now rested unused. Storehouses closed, messages stopped arriving. The structure that had organized their days disappeared almost at once. Inside one residence, a young retainer named Ichiro folded his former lord's banner slowly and placed it beside an empty rack where armor had hung only days ago. Rooms that once held preparation and anticipation now held only stillness. In the language of the time, these men became Ronin, masterless samurai. The word carries a quiet weight. It did not describe failure, it describes uncertainty. Without a lord, their duties no longer had a clear direction. Their training remains, their loyalty remains. But the place where those qualities existed had disappeared. For many, the future narrowed into ordinary survival. Some returned to farming families they had not seen in years. Others accepted small work as guards or clerks in unfamiliar towns. A few entered temples. Many simply waited, unsure whether waiting itself still meant anything. Among them, however, memory remained steady. The event at Edo Castle did not disappear when the domain ended. It lingered in conversations spoken carefully and in silences that required no explanation. The question of what loyalty meant after a lord's death did not demand immediate answers. Only required patience. Armor racks stood empty in several houses that spring. Not abandoned, but untouched. Polished helmets rested beside folded garments that will not be worn again soon. Spears remained upright against walls that no longer resonates with morning preparation. The absence itself became part of daily life. From a distance it might have seemed that everything had ended with Asano's death. But revenge did not begin with anger. In the weeks after their lord's death, Ichiro learned to walk differently through the streets of Edo, not slower, not faster, simply as though nothing had changed. One morning he passed a familiar figure near a narrow bridge where merchants sold bundles of paper and dried fish. For a moment, both men recognized one another. Their sleeves shifted slightly, their steps almost slowed down, but neither spoke, neither bowed, neither paused. They continued walking in opposite directions as if they had never met at all. To anyone watching, nothing unusual had happened, and that was the point. After the dissolution of Akko domain, the retainers of Asano Naganori did not gather together in protest. They did not remain visible as a group. They did not announce intentions or grievances. Instead, they spread outward across towns and roads like mist thinning across morning fields. Some returned quietly to provincial villages. Others accepted temporary work as clerks, guards, or instructors. A few entered temple service. Many simply disappeared into ordinary life. This dispersal was not disordered, it was preparation. The shogunate expected unrest after the death of a lord. Its officials watched dismissed retainers carefully in the months that followed. Messengers passed through districts where former samurai had settled. Reports were written, names were noted, movements were observed without announcement. Nothing dramatic appeared in those reports, and that too was intentional. In marketplaces, former retainers learned to stand like merchants. They carried bundles instead of swords. They spoke in quieter voices. They accepted the slow rhythm of daily labor without complaint. A man who had once trained with armor each morning now counted deliveries of rice. Another copied documents by lantern light instead of drilling with spear formations at dawn. Loyalty did not disappear. It changed its clothing. Even those who remained in Edo avoid patterns that might draw attention. They did not visit another one openly. They did not gather in groups large enough to be remembered. Streets that had once echoed with shared duty now held only passing shadows of recognition. Winter arrived once, then passed. Still they waited. Among them moved Oishi Kuranosuke Yoshio, though not in the way observers expected. As the former chief retainer of their lost lord, he was watched more closely than most. Officials assumed that if revenge were planned, it would begin with him. So he allowed them to watch. At first, he remained quiet. Later, he appears less careful. He visited taverns more often than before. He stayed out late into the evening. Sometimes he spoke loudly enough to be remembered by those nearby. On certain nights, he seemed unsteady as he walked home beneath lantern light. Rumors followed him easily. Some said grief had broken his discipline. Others believed disappointed had turned him careless. A few concluded he had abandoned purpose entirely. These conclusions traveled quickly through Edo, and that too was intentional. Carelessness, when seen often enough, becomes believable. Officials who expected vigilance gradually observed something else instead. The man they had watched most closely appeared to be fading into ordinary distractions. His reputation shifts slowly, almost gently, from expectation toward forgetfulness. Suspicion softened, time wore moving. Meanwhile, other former retainers adopted quieter disguises. One learned the routines of port labor along the waterfront. Another delivered messages between districts for small payment. A third repaired tools in a workshop where no one asked about his past. Their swords were gone. Their sins remained. Season followed season, without announcement. Summer heat settled into narrow streets. Autumn returned with drifting leaves across canal edges. Winter followed again, carrying cold wind along the same bridges where they had once passed each other without greeting. The city forgot them gradually, or I believed it had. Administrative commentary from the period suggests that officials eventually reduced their attention to scattered former retainers once no immediate unrest appeared. Without visible organization, there seemed little reason to continue watching closely. Years in government service had taught these observers to expect patterns before danger. Here, no pattern appears. Only quiet lives wall. Even so, memory remains steady beneath the surface. Ichiro sometimes crossed districts where he had once trained beside men he now passed without acknowledgement. Their steps remained measured. Their shoulders remained upright. Their silence remained deliberate. No signal was exchanged, yet something passed between them each time their paths crossed. Recognition without movement, agreement without speaking, waiting without instructions. In the evenings, lantern light reflected softly across narrow streets where merchants closed their shutters and families returned indoors. Somewhere beyond those quiet doorways, the dismissed retainers continued their separate routines. Each appeared alone. Each seemed ordinary. Each allowed the city to forget him a little more. Patience became their shared language. Snow returned once more to Edo before the pattern changed. It gathered along rooftops and bridges in thin layers that softened sound across the city. Footsteps became quieter. Voices carried less distance. Even the movement of carts along the road seemed slower beneath the weight of winter air. To those watching casually, nothing unusual happened during those months. No meetings, no announcements, no preparations visible to the eye. And yet beneath this stillness, something else continues moving. The men who had once served together had not abandoned their purpose. They had only allowed time to pass over them like weather across a field. Their separation had not weakened them. It had protected them. Their silence had not ended loyalty. It had preserved it. They waited through one winter, then another, and while they appeared scattered, they were quietly counting the months. Snow had already begun to settle across the streets of Edo when Ichiro stepped quietly into position beside the outer wall. It wasn't deep snow, not enough to slow movement, only enough to soften the sound. The city lay unusually still that night. Roof lines carried thin white edges. Lantern light reflected gently from frozen ground. Even the narrow wooden bridges crossing the canals seemed quieter than usual, as though the air itself had chosen restraint. This was the night they had been waiting for. Nearly 2 years had passed since the death of Asano Naganori. 2 winters had come and gone. 2 summers had warmed the same streets through which they once walked without greeting one another. Now the waiting is over. The target of their long patience stood ahead of them, the residence of Kira Yoshinaka. And it was not a fortress, it was a city estate, enclosed by walls but woven into the ordinary structure of Edo itself. Neighbors slept nearby. Merchants' houses stood only a short distance away. The night held no announcement of what was about to happen. Everything remained quiet, and that quietness was necessary. The group approximately in 2 carefully coordinated sections. Each man carries equipment suited not only for combat, but for movement through a sleeping neighborhood. Ladders were placed deliberately against the outer wall. Signals were exchanged without raised voices. Even the timing of their steps followed a pattern practiced long before that night arrived. Nothing was hurried, each motion had been shaped in advance. Years of training had taught them how to move together without confusion. But this night requires something more than skill. It requires agreement. Every man present understands that what they were doing would end not only one life, but also their own futures as free retainers within the shogunate's order. Still they climbed. Snow shifted softly beneath their feet as they crossed the outer boundary of the estate. Inside, the garden lay still beneath bare winter branches. No dogs barked, no alarm carried across the courtyard. Only the faint sound of clothing brushing against wood followed them forward. The house itself stood dark except for a few interior lamps. Carefully, they divided again. One group secures the front entrance, another moved toward the rear. Messengers remained positioned along the perimeter to prevent escape or confusion. Every position had been assigned in advance, and every responsibility had been accepted long before the night began. Coordination replaced noise, preparation replaced surprise. Inside the residence, the first doors opened quietly. Servants were restrained but not harmed. Guards were confronted quickly and with precision. Movement through the interior follows a pattern almost like the careful construction of a structure, each step placed where it supports the next. The attack unfolded the way a craftsman assembles a frame. One beam after another, one joint after another. No part rushed ahead of the others. Snow continued falling outside as they searched the rooms of the house. Corridors opened into storage spaces. Storage spaces opened into sleeping chambers. Sliding doors revealed empty rooms where lamps burned low beside folded bedding. They continued searching, signature, patiently, and at last they found him. Kira Yoshinaka had been hidden in a storage area at the rear of the residence. He was discovered not through chaos, but through methodical movement from room to room, each space examined without haste. When they brought him forward, the courtyard remained silent. The snow had thickened slightly. Lantern light reflected from its surface in soft yellow circles that did not reach far beyond the gathered figures. According to later preserved records, a written statement explains their purpose had been prepared in advance and left behind after the attack. It describes their actions not as rebellion, but as fulfillment of obligation. The language was formal, the reasoning is clear. They had waited, they had confirmed, they had acted only after patience had run its course. The message remained, like a signature at the end of careful work. After the deed was completed, the group did not scatter into the city. They did not hide. Instead, they gathered their formation once more and began walking together through the quiet winter streets toward the temple where their former lord had been buried. Snow continued falling as they moved. Their footsteps formed a single line behind them, visible only until morning light would erase it. Passers-by who later heard what had happened described the procession as calm rather than urgent. No one ran. No one shouted. The city received the news gradually as dawn almost. At the grave of Asano Naganori, they placed what they had carried with them across 2 years of waiting, the proof that loyalty had not disappeared when their domain ended. There, before the resting place of the man they had served, they completed the final gesture of their duty. Only then did the movement of the night come to rest. Ichiro remains near the outer gate after the others finished their offering. Snow gathered slowly along the edges of his sleeves. The lantern beside the entrance flickered once in the cold air before settling again into stillness. He knelt there for a moment longer than necessary. Not because instructions required it, but because the waiting that had filled the previous years had finally ended. Behind him, the others prepared to continue toward the authorities, who will decide what came next. None of them expected escape. None of them misunderstood the consequences of what they had done. They had completed their work, like craftsmen setting down their tools after the final joint had been secured. Yet what followed mattered more than the revenge itself. Before dawn fully reached the streets of Edo, Ichiro placed his swords carefully beside him and waited. He did not hide them. He didn't carry them again. They rested on the floor exactly where he could see them. Their polished surfaces reflected the faint grey light that entered through the paper screen. Outside, the city was already beginning to wake. Footsteps passed in distant lanes. A door opened somewhere nearby. Someone carried water across frozen ground. Ordinary morning had returned. Yet for the men who had walked through the snow the night before, something had already ended. After completing their duty at the grave of Asano Naganori, the former retainers did not flee the city. Instead, they divided into small groups and presented themselves voluntarily to officials of the Tokugawa shogunate. This decision was not forced upon them. It had been expected since the beginning. They understood that revenge carried consequences as carefully structured as the etiquette of the court where their lord had first drawn his sword. Acting outside the authority of the shogunate cannot be ignored. Even when loyalty explains their actions, the law still requires an answer. So they waited for judgment. The city, meanwhile, began to talk about them. News traveled quickly across Edo. Merchants repeat the story in shop doorways. Travelers carried it across bridges. Priests discussed it quietly beside temple steps. The tale of the 47 former retainers who had waited nearly 2 years before acting did not feel like ordinary violence. It felt like something older, something measured, something deliberate. Public sympathy grew steadily. People who had never met these men began leaving offerings at the gravesite of their former lord at Sengakuji. Incense burned there throughout the day. Visitors arrived not in crowds at first, but in a quiet, continuous stream that did not stop. They came because the story made sense to them. In the moral language of the time, loyalty was not separate from identity. A retainer exists in relation to a lord the way a star exists within a constellation. Alone, each point of light could still be seen. Together they formed meaning. When their lord disappeared, the constellation had not disappeared. It had only changed shape. Officials of the shogunate now face a difficult decision. If they ignore the attack on Kira Yoshinaka, as they risk weakening the authority that keeps peace across the country. But if they punished the men too harshly, they risked contradicting the very ideals of loyalty that supported the samurai order itself. Law and honor stood facing one another. Neither could easily step aside. For weeks, discussions continued quietly within government circles. Advisors weighed precedent, records from earlier cases were examined, opinions differed. Some argue that discipline must remain absolute. Others believe that the retainer's patients had already demonstrated respect for authority rather than rebellion against it. The question was not whether punishment would come, the question was what kind. During this time, the former retainers lived under supervision in several residences across Edo. They were not treated like criminals in chains. They were treated as men whose actions required resolution. Meals were provided, visitors were limited, conversations remained calm, waiting for him once more. But this waiting feels different from the 2 years that had preceded the attack. Now the future moves toward them instead of away. Eventually, the judgment was announced. The men would be permitted to perform seppuku. To modern ears, this may sound like serious loneliness. Yet within the structure of samurai law, it is recognized as well as sentence. They would not be executed publicly as criminals. They will end their lives according to the ritual reserved for warriors who had preserved dignity even in disobedience. Honor and law had found a narrow place where they could stand together. On the appointed day, our preparations were made quietly across the houses where the retainers waited. Each man received the required garments for the ceremony. Witnesses assembled according to established practice. Words were spoken briefly and without ornament, just as they had been when their lord performed the same act 2 years earlier. One by one they followed him. The story did not end with silence. Afterward, their graves were placed together near their lord's resting place at Sengakuji. Visitors continued arriving long after the ceremonies were completed. Incense smoke rose there in thin lines that drifted upward through winter air. Offerings appear beside the stones and remain even after snow had passed across the cemetery paths. Citizens returned again and again, not because they had been invited to come, because they wished to remember. Over time, the retainers themselves began to change in public memory. They were no longer only former samurai who had taken revenge. They became examples of something larger. Stories about them traveled beyond Edo. Plays were written. Poems repeat their names. Children learned the sequence of events long before they understood the details of court protocol that had begun it all. History slowly turned into tradition. Tradition slowly turned into legend, yet behind that legend remains a quieter truth. The men had not acted quickly, they had not acted recklessly, they had waited through seasons, through suspicion, through uncertainty, and through the knowledge that their actions would eventually require their own lives in return. They had followed a path already visible to them from the beginning. Like stars moving across winter sky, but their course had seemed slow to anyone watching from below. But the direction never changes. It remained steady from the first day their lord died until the final morning they set down their swords. In this way, loyalty did not defeat the law, it moved beside it. And far away in medieval Europe, another ritual was shaping warriors long before they reached real battlefields. Before sunrise had fully reached the edges of the tournament field, Matteo was already awake beside his horse. The ground beneath his boots was still cold from the night. Frost clung slightly to the grass where the ropes of the enclosure stretched between wooden posts. Beyond them, the open space of the lists waited in silence. No banners yet moved in the wind, no armor rang against saddles, no voices crossed the field. Only preparation had begun. Matteo checked the strap beneath the horse's neck once more, then tightened the leather at the saddle ring with slow, practiced pressure. He didn't hurry. A strap fastened too quickly could loosen later. A buckle, left uncertain, could shift at the wrong moment. In tournaments, as in battle, small adjustments mattered long before movement began. The field itself had already been measured the evening before. This enclosed space was known simply as the lists. It was not chosen randomly. Officials marked its boundaries carefully so that everyone present understood where combat would begin and where it would end. Within these ropes, motion follows rules. Outside them, the world remains ordinary again. The lists separated practice from danger. Yet they also brought the two closer together. The medieval tournaments were not spontaneous displays of courage. They were organized by expectation, reputation, and careful structure. Nobles traveled long distances to attend them. Horses were transported across regions. Armor was inspected before use. Heralds recorded names so that victories and losses would be remembered correctly. Nothing about the field was accidental. Even before the first riders appeared, the arrangement of space told a story about discipline. Wooden divided barriers opposing sides. Viewing areas rose along the edges for spectators who arrived gradually as the morning brightened. Colored banners marked the presence of noble household. Their fabric moved softly in the early air, signaling alliances without the need for speech. Each color carried recognition. Each symbol carried memory. Dai Matteo moved along the edge of the enclosure as other riders began to arrive. Some spoke quietly with attendants. Others checked the fittings of their helmets in silence. A few stood beside their horses without moving at all, as though waiting for the field itself to settle before stepping into it. No one entered the lists carelessly. A trumpet sounded once from the far end of the enclosure. The note did not startle anyone. It did not command urgency. Instead, it marks the beginning of attention. Conversations slowed down. Riders lift their heads. Even spectators who had just arrived near the ropes turned toward the sound without needing explanation. The trumpet announced presence before action. Its voice carried across the field like the opening of a sentence that would take the entire day to complete. See, in manuscripts preserved today in collections such as the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, images of tournament fields often show these same arrangements repeated again and again. The ropes, the banners, the spectators, and the heralds all appear as parts of a single structure. The combat itself was only one element within a larger pattern. Tournaments create orders before they create movements. For young knights like Matteo, the lists served as a place where training became visible. Skills practiced quietly for years in courtyards and fields now entered a shared space where others can observe them. Balance in the saddle, control of the reins, and awareness of distance were no longer private exercises. They became part of a public language. Every motion spoke. Some riders enter the field with confidence that came from long experience, and others moved more carefully, measuring each step before committing to it. Yet both kinds of movement belong equally to the purpose of the tournament. The lists did not demand perfection, they demanded presence. To stand inside the enclosure meant accepting observation. Heralds walked along the edges recording names and announcing pairings. Their voices carried information clearly but without excitement. They described lineages, alliances, and titles with the same steady tone used in earlier gatherings. Nothing about their speech suggested surprise. Everything suggested continuity. The tournament was not an interruption of ordinary life. It was part of its rhythm. Spectators gathered gradually along the viewing lines. Some arrived to watch relatives. Others came to observe unfamiliar riders whose reputations had traveled ahead of them. Children leaned forward against the ropes to see armor more closely. Merchants moved quietly between groups, offering small goods suited to long hours outdoors. The field filled without haste. Sunlight reached the banners slowly. As the morning brightened, the lists began to resemble a mouth preparing to speak. The ropes form its edges. The riders gathered like words waiting to be arranged. The trumpet's earlier note remained suspended in memory, ready to return when movement began again. Nothing had happened yet, and still everything had already begun. For nobles, tournaments served purposes beyond display. They allowed families to measure alliances without conflict. They provide opportunities for younger knights to demonstrate readiness for service. And they create spaces where reputation could grow gradually rather than suddenly on distant battlefields. The lists were a conversation carried out in motion. Each rider answered another with careful response rather than uncontrolled force. Matteo adjusted his gloves once more as the second trumpet call moved across the enclosure. This sound traveled farther than the first. It reached spectators standing at the far edge of the viewing ground. It reached attendants holding spare lances beside supply wagons. It reached riders who had not yet mounted their horses. Now attention became ready. The field no longer waited, yet the spectacle hides a quieter purpose beneath its color. When the riders finally entered the lists together, the field did not erupt into chaos. It settled into motion, as Matteo guided his horse forward in a slow line beside the others, keeping the distance between saddles steady as they crossed the grass. No one rushed ahead, no one broke formation. Even before the first signal to begin, the arrangement of bodies across the field already revealed what tournaments were meant to do. They taught movement together. To an observer watching from the ropes, the gathering might have looked like spectacles. Armor reflects the morning light. Banners shifted in the wind. Horses stepped carefully over ground already marked by earlier passes. Yet beneath the color and sound, something quieter was happening. This was practice. Not the private kind that took place in courtyards or along forest edges, but a public rehearsal for cooperation in battle. Riders learned how to watch one another without turning their heads, and they learned how to adjust speed without breaking alignment. They learned how to respond to signals carried by horn or banner rather than voice alone. War requires coordination long before it requires courage. In early tournaments, one of the most important events was not the single mounted charge often remembered today, but the melee. During these encounters, groups of riders moved across the field together in formations that resembled controlled fragments of real warfare. Lines advanced, withdrawn, turned, and regrouped in patterns that trained attention as much as strength. The movement appeared unexpectedly from a distance. Up close, it follows structure. Medieval writers such as Geoffroy de Charny described tournaments as places where knights could prepare themselves for the demands of actual campaigns without entering open conflict. One that he wrote not only about bravery, but about discipline, patience, and judgment. These qualities could not be developed in isolation. They require shared experience. The lists provided that experience. Matteo watched the riders ahead of him carefully as the formation shifted. A signal passed from one side of the field to the other, carried first by movement, then by echo. Horses changed direction almost together, lances lowered, shields turned slightly to meet approaching figures whose identities were already known but whose intentions still had to be read in motion. Training took place inside uncertainty. This uncertainty was deliberate. Weapons used in tournaments were often altered so that they struck with reduced sharpness. Edges were softened, points were rounded, blades remain heavy enough to teach control, or yet less likely to cause fatal injury during practice. These adjustments did not remove danger entirely. Riders could still fall, horses could still collide, but the changes allowed learning to continue without turning every encounter into loss. Risk remained present, it simply became measured. From the sidelines, spectators followed these shifting patterns with quiet attention. They did not need to understand every detail to recognize its meaning. The movement of riders across the field resembled something familiar, even to those who had never entered battle themselves. It looked like preparation. It looked like a rehearsal. Within the formation, Matteo felt the rhythm change as another signal passed through the group. Riders adjusted their spacing again. One line slowed down, another advanced. A dust lifted slightly beneath hooves as the field carried their motion forward without resistance. Each rider depends on the others. No single movement belongs entirely to one person. In this way, tournaments helped create trust before campaigns began. A knight who had trained beside another rider in the lists already knew something about how that rider responded under pressure. He knew how quickly the other adjusted direction. He knew whether signals were followed immediately or slowly. He knew how closely formation could be maintained when the movement became crowded. These small observations mattered later. Battle rarely allowed introductions. Authorities who governed medieval towns and regions understood the importance of such preparation. Regulations appeared gradually to ensure that tournaments remained controlled rather than destructive. Arm boundaries were marked more clearly. Weapon types were specified more carefully. Officials supervised entry and exit so that the lists remain a place of learning rather than uncontrolled violence. Order protected practice. Practice protected communities. Even so, injuries still occurred. Horses stumbled, riders lose balance, armor failed under unexpected strain. The field carries reminders that preparation for war could never become entirely safe. Yet these risks were accepted because they allowed something more valuable to grow: experience. Matteo noticed how older knights watched the younger riders as carefully as they watched their opponents. Advice passed quietly between encounters. Adjustments were suggested without ceremony. A hand lifted slightly in demonstration. A shoulder turned to indicate a better angle of approach. Teaching moved through the formation without words. Over time, this shared learning changed the meaning of the tournament field itself. It was no longer only a place where strength could be displayed. It became a place where judgment could be refined. Riders who returned again and again carried away something more lasting than applause. They carried understanding. Across Europe, similar scenes unfolded in fields marked by ropes and banners much like this one. From northern France to the German principalities and beyond, the lists create spaces where preparation could take place in public view without becoming open conflict. Communities gathered around these events not only for spectacle, but for reassurance. War, when it comes, will not arrive without warning. It will arrive among people already practiced in moving together. Matteo guided his horse back toward the edge of the formation as the movement slowed again. The trumpet sounded once more, signaling a pause that allowed riders to adjust equipment and breathe before the next exchange. Around him, armor settled into stillness. Horses lower their heads. Dust returned quietly to the ground. The field rested between motions, and victory in tournaments often means more than applause. By the time the afternoon light began to soften across the tournament field, the rhythm of movement inside the lists had already changed. What began as training now became opportunity. Matteo stood beside his horse near the edge of the enclosure, watching two riders approach one another for another controlled exchange. Their lances lowered slowly, not in anger, but in concentration. Around them, spectators leaned forward slightly, not because they expected danger, but because they understood what might follow. Victory here meant more than applause, it meant possibility. In many medieval tournaments, success brought material rewards as well as reputation. A knight who unhorsed an opponent might claim that opponents' equipment according to agreed customs, saddles, helmets, shields, and sometimes even horses themselves, could pass from one rider to another through these encounters. The transfer was not random. It followed expectations known to everyone present long before the event began. Skills could become livelihood, armor was expensive to produce, horses trained for mounted combat require years of care. Even a single successful exchange might change the circumstances of a younger knight who had arrived with limited resources. Winning equipment allows him to appear again at future tournaments better prepared than before. Each victory extends the road ahead. Historical descriptions collected in works such as those of Richard Barber and Juliet Barker show how carefully these customs were understood. Ransom agreements often followed encounters in which one rider gained advantage over another. The defeated knight could reclaim his equipment by offering payment later, preserving both dignity and relationship between participants. Competition did not end cooperation. It depended on it. Matteo watched as attendants approximately one rider whose lance had struck with greater control than his opponent's. The exchange ended without injury. Helmets were removed. Words passed quietly between the two men. A decision followed that seemed almost ordinary to those nearby, and a horse would change hands. The spectators did not react with surprise. They had seen such transfers before. Within the structure of the tournament, this exchange represents recognition rather than humiliation. Equipment moved from one rider to another, the way knowledge moved between teachers and students. Signature. Respectfully. These moments shaped reputations that extend far beyond the field itself. Noble families observed the performance of riders closely. Heralds recorded outcomes. News traveled along roads connecting courts and households across regions. A knight who demonstrates skill repeatedly in tournaments might find invitations waiting for him elsewhere long after the banners of one event had been lowered. The lists opened doors that could not be seen. Marriage alliances sometimes followed such recognition. A young rider who proved reliable in public encounters gained attention not only from fellow knights, but from families seeking trusted partners for daughters and estates. The tournament field became a place where futures were measured without formal negotiation. Movement spoke where contracts had not yet begun. Matteo noted how older knights greeted one another after encounters, their gestures steady and familiar. Hands rested briefly on shoulders. Helmets were returned with care. Attendants carried equipment across the grass without hurry. Nothing about these exchanges suggested rivalry alone. They suggested continuity. The spectators understood this as well. From their places along the edge of the lists, they followed the shifting fortunes of riders throughout the day. Children remembered names repeated by heralds. The merchants repeat those names later in nearby streets. Nobles carried impressions with them when they returned home. Reputation traveled faster than horses. Even those who did not win equipment gained something less visible but equally important. Presence inside the lists marks a rider as someone prepared to stand before testimony and accept judgment without complaint. This prepared alone carries meaning within a society where honor depends as much on appearance as on outcome. To be seen was to belong. To belong was to continue. Heralds played a quiet role in preserving this memory. Moving along the edges of the enclosure, they recorded names and symbols associated with each participant. Shields painted with distinctive designs allow observers to recognize riders even from a distance. These markings form a language that connects individuals to families, regions, and histories extending beyond the field itself. Color carries identity. Pattern carried lineage. As the afternoon progressed, the pace of encounters slowed slightly. Horses rested between exchanges, attendants replaced damaged equipment, riders removed helmets long enough to drink water and speak with companions before returning once more to the open ground. No one rushes the day toward its ending. Tournaments unfolded gradually because their purpose extended beyond any single moment of success. Each exchange contributed to a larger pattern of recognition that followed participants throughout their lives. A rider remembered for steadiness one year might return the next, with stronger allies and clearer expectations. And the lists rewarded patience as much as strength. Matteo adjusted the strap at his wrist again while watching another pair of riders complete their exchange. One removed his helmet and briefly smiled before returning it to his head. The gesture was small, almost private. Yet it carried the quiet satisfaction of someone who understood that the field had given him something lasting. Not only equipment, direction. And as tournaments continued to change over time, the meaning of victory itself began to change with them. By late afternoon, the light across the tournament field had begun to change. Shadows stretched longer between the posts that marked the boundaries of the lists. Horses moved more slowly now, their earlier energy settling into a quieter rhythm. The banners above the enclosure still lifted in the wind, but their movement no longer suggested preparation. Instead, it suggests conclusion. Matteo stood beside his horse and listened. The crowd had grown quieter, not silent, but attentive in a different way. Earlier in the day, voices had followed each encounter with quick excitement. Now the sound moves more slowly across the field. People leaned forward not because they expected surprise, but because they recognized that something ceremonial was approaching. The tournament was no longer only practice, it had become performance. In earlier centuries, gatherings like this had resembled fragments of real warfare shaped into safer forms. Riders trained together in wide formations, groups tested coordination. Now, movement across the lists prepared men for campaigns that might begin months later. Yet as time passed, especially in the courts of Western Europe, tournaments began to change their purpose. They still taught the skill, but they also began to display identity. Heraldic banners rose higher along the edges of the field, marking the presence of noble houses whose colors were now recognized as carefully as their riders. Fabric once carried into battle for recognition in smoke and confusion now moved in open air, where spectators could study it without urgency. The lists became a place lineage where could be seen as clearly as strength, color replacement uncertainty, recognition replaced danger. Temporary wooden galleries stood along parts of the enclosure where spectators gathered in greater numbers than before. The families arrived not only to observe technique, but to participate in shared celebration. Musicians sometimes played between encounters. Vendors moved carefully through the edges of the crowd. The field became part of civic life rather than preparation for distant campaigns alone. The tournament had entered the town. Late medieval ordinances from courts such as Burgundy described changes to equipment that reflected this transformation. Lances were fitted with specially shaped tips designed to spread the force of impact rather than concentrate it. Instead of piercing armor, they struck broadly and broke more easily. These adjustments reduced the chance of serious injury while preserving the appearance of contest. Strength remained visible, risk was measured, armor itself changed in response to this new environment. Helmets gained reinforced ridges shaped to deflect impact more predictably. Breastplates were polished more brightly than before, reflecting light as much as protecting the body beneath. The field still holds danger, but it also holds intention. Movement now carries meaning beyond survival. Heralds continued their work along the edges of the lists, announcing names with voices that traveled clearly across the enclosure. Each introduction followed a familiar pattern to those listening. Lineage was spoken, titles were repeated, Symbols painted on shields were carefully described so that even distant spectators could understand who entered the field. Identity moved through sound before motion began. Matteo watched as two riders preparing for what would likely be the final exchange of the day. Attendants adjusted straps along the saddles. The gloves were tightened once more, helmets lowered into place. Nothing about their preparations suggested urgency. Instead, it suggested agreement. Everyone present understands what this moment represents. The trumpet sounded again. Its tone carried farther than earlier signals had done. It crossed the wooden galleries. It reached merchants waiting near the outer ropes. It passed over children seated beside their families. The sound gathered attention the way a bell gathers listeners before evening prayer. The field listened. Then, just before the riders began their final charge, something unexpected happened. The crowd remained. Not completely silent, but close enough that the smallest sounds returned clearly. Leather shifts against saddles, hooves pressed gently into the grass. When the wind moved once along the edges of the banners and then seemed to pause as well. Matteo felt the stillness before he understood it. This quiet was not hesitant. It was recognition. The tournament had become a shared ritual. Moments like this were remembered long after the field itself returned to pasture. People spoke later about the way the banners moved that afternoon. They recall how heralds announced names. They remembered how riders lowered their lances at exactly the same distance from one another. These details became part of memory because they belonged to ceremony rather than accident. The lists now preserve reputation as carefully as they once preserved skill. Across many towns and courts, tournaments gradually joined seasonal festivals that marked important moments in civic life. Its citizens gathered not only to watch riders compete, but to participate in a shared experience of order and display. Processions entered the field before contests began, musicians accompanying introductions. Judges recorded outcomes that would be repeated later in halls, far from the lists themselves. The field spoke to the town answered. Even riders understood the difference. Their movements remained disciplined, but their purpose extended beyond preparation for war. They rode before now testify who measured grace as carefully as strength. Success still mattered. Yet presence itself had become part of achievement. Matteo watched the two riders begin their approach. The distance between them shortened slowly, lances lowered, hooves pressed forward in steady rhythm. The crowd remained quiet until the moment of impact, and when wood struck wood, and the sound carried across the enclosure like a closing note at the end of a long sentence. Splinters fell into the grass. Horses slowed down, helmets lifted again, and the field releases its breath. By the time the banners began to lower and spectators turned toward the roads leading home, the meaning of the tournament had shifted once more. It was no longer only a rehearsal for the battle. It had become a language of ceremony shared by entire communities. Elsewhere in medieval towns, warmth gathered not around armor, but around water. In a narrow medieval street where timber houses lean slightly toward one another across the road, a small doorway stands open beneath a wooden sign painted with a simple basin. Warm air drifted outward from inside, not strongly, or just enough that anyone passing nearby could feel the difference between the chill of the street and the gentler atmosphere waiting beyond the threshold. Hannah stood just inside the entrance, holding a folded bundle of linen across her arms. She checked each piece carefully before placing it onto a wooden shelf beside the doorway. Some cloths will be used only once that day. Others will return to drying racks before evening. Each had its place in the quiet rhythm of the bathhouse. Rarely visitors enter without pausing first. The transition from street to steam was meant to be noticed. Inside, the air changed gradually. The scent of warmed wood replaced the sharper smell of outdoor smoke. Footsteps softened as they crossed, from packed earth to smoother floorboards worn pale by years of use. Voices carried differently here, moving more slowly through the damp warmth gathering near the ceiling. The bathhouse did not hide itself. It invited entry gently. Across many medieval towns in Central and Western Europe, bathhouses stand as familiar parts of urban life. They were neither rare nor reserved only for the wealthy. Instead, they formed part of weekly routine, much like markets or bakeries. People arrived in the late afternoon after work, or earlier on days when washing had become part of household custom. Cleanliness belongs to the community. At the entrance, visitors often exchange a small payment for the use of linen. Cloths were provided not only for modesty, but for comfort. Fresh fabric placed between skin and bench allowed warmth to remain pleasant rather than overwhelming. Hannah unfolded each piece carefully before handing it forward, her movements steady and practiced from long repetition. Linen carried preparation with it. Beyond the entrance room, a second chamber held wooden benches arranged along the walls. Here, visitors removed outer garments and stored them safely before moving further inside. Conversations began quietly in this space. Neighbors greeted one another, travelers asked for directions, friends exchanged news gathered during the day's work. The bathhouse received people as they were. No special clothing was required. Further within, the air thickened slightly with steam rising from heated water basins. Large tubs stood near the center of the room. Their surfaces reflect light from narrow windows set high in the walls. Attendants moved slowly between them, carrying buckets that released gentle clouds of warmth as they passed. Hannah stepped beside one of the basins and poured another ladle of warmed water across its surface. The sound was soft and steady, like rain falling against wood during early evening. Steam lifted briefly, then settled again near the ceiling beams where it drifted in quiet layers. Warmth gathered the way mist gathers over fields at sunrise. No sudden change marks the moment when visitors began to relax. Instead, the body adjusted gradually. Cold fingers warmed first, shoulders loosened, breath deepened slightly as the air became easier to carry into the lungs. The bathhouse did not hurry these changes. It allows them to arrive on their own. Municipal regulations preserved in several German and Italian town archives describe how bathhouses operated according to predictable weekly rhythms. Certain days were reserved for families. Others welcomed travelers arriving from surrounding roads. In some towns, evening hours remained open longer during winter months when darkness came early and warmth was needed most. The building followed the season. So did the people inside it. Benches near the walls allow visitors to rest between immersions. Some sat quietly, letting warmth settle into their hands. Others speak in low voices that blended easily with the sound of water moving from bucket to basin. No single conversation dominates the room. Instead, the space carried many small exchanges at once, none louder than the others. Steam softened distance between voices. Light entered from above in narrow lines that shifted slowly across the room as the afternoon passed. Wooden beams darkened by years of moisture held that light gently, reflecting it back into the space without glare. The atmosphere remains calm even as new visitors arrived and others prepared to leave. Movement remains continuous but unhurried. Hannah crossed the floor again, carrying another folded bundle of linen. She paused beside a bench where an older visitor rested quietly, then placed the cloth nearby without interrupting his thoughts. This simple gesture belongs to the daily work of the bathhouse as surely as the heating of water itself. Care moved through the room without announcement. For many who entered, the bathhouse represented more than washing alone. It marked a pause between the demands of work and the return home. Time spent here belongs neither entirely to labor nor entirely to rest. It exists somewhere between the two, where warmth could be shared without haste. Even children understand this rhythm. They learned early that certain evenings ended not beside the hearth at home, but beside the larger basins where neighbors gathered together. Familiar voices followed them through steam. Familiar hands guided them safely along wet floorboards. Familiar routines shaped their memory of comfort. The bathhouse became part of growing up. Visitors stepping back outside later in the evening carried warmth with them into the colder streets beyond the doorway. The contrast remains gentle rather than sharp. Steam followed them briefly before dissolving into night air. Behind them, the wooden sign above the entrance continued to mark the place where warmth waited again tomorrow. But bathing was not only about cleanliness. As the steam settled gently beneath the beams of the bathhouse ceiling, Hannah moved toward a small wooden shelf where bundles of dried herbs hung in quiet rows above her reach. She selected one carefully. Not every visitor requires the same preparation. Some arrived with stiff shoulders from traveling along winter roads. Others carry the heaviness of long hours spent working with tools or animals. A few came simply because the season itself had grown cold enough that warmth felt necessary again. The herbs answered these differences without hurry. Hannah lowered the bundle into a basin of warmed water and waited as its scent slowly opened into the air. The fragrance did not appear all at once. It spread gradually, in the way morning light spreads across a courtyard wall. In medieval towns across Europe, the bathhouses were not only places where dirt was washed away, they were also places where the body was believed to return to balance. According to medical teaching preserved in texts such as the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, health depends on maintaining harmony between several natural fluids thought to move quietly inside the body. These inner substances were believed to shape mood, strength, and comfort throughout the seasons. When they fell out of balance, the body felt heavier, colder, or less steady than before. Warm water helped restore that balance. Steam helped the body release what it no longer needed to carry. People who entered the bathhouse did not speak of this in technical language. They understood it through experience. After sitting beside warmed basins, movement became easier. Breathing felt deeper. And muscles that had tightened during travel began to loosen again. Relief arrived slowly. Often the water itself carries more than heat alone. Bath attendants added herbs chosen for their scent and their traditional associations with comfort. Rosemary might be used for tired limbs, sage for the heaviness of damp weather, juniper for the lingering chill that settled after long journeys through snow. These additions did not change the water suddenly, they deepened it. Steam rising from the basins carries these scents upward toward the rafters before drifting gently across the room. Visitors sitting nearby felt the warmth along settled their shoulders, while the fragrance moved quietly through the air around them. No instruction was needed. The body responds on its own. The bathhouse worked with patience rather than force. In some towns, barber surgeons offered small treatments within the same building. Their work did not resemble the large operations imagined today. Instead, they performed careful adjustments meant to restore comfort rather than transform the body completely. A stiff joint might be eased, a minor swelling examined. A tooth causing persistent discomfort might be removed with steady attention rather than haste. These services remain part of ordinary routine. The barber surgeon's tools rested nearby but never dominated the room. Most visitors continued their washing without interruption, while these smaller procedures took place quietly along the edges of the space. The bathhouse remains a place of warmth first, and treatment second. Care moved without drawing attention to itself. Bundles of herbs hanging from ceiling beams shifted slightly as warm air passed beneath them. Their shapes changed slowly over time as each bundle grew lighter with use. Attendants replaced them when needed, often prepare new mixtures in advance of colder months when visitors arrived more often. The room reminds the seasons. Steam itself played an important role in this quiet process of restoration. Warm air filled with moisture softened the skin and opened its surface gently. This allows the body to release what it carried after long days of labor or travel. Visitors did not describe this in scientific terms. They described it simply as feeling lighter when they left than when they arrived. The difference requires no explanation. Some bathhouses arranged their rooms in stages so that visitors gradually moved from warmer spaces to cooler ones before returning outside. This gentle sequence allows the body to adjust slowly rather than suddenly. The felt transition natural, like stepping from afternoon sunlight into evening shade. Comfort followed, entered. Hana returned to the basin she had prepared earlier and stirred the water once more with a wooden ladle. The surface shifted softly, releasing another thin cloud of scented vapor that rose toward the beams above her head. Nearby visitors continued speaking in quiet voices that blended easily with the sound of moving water. Nothing in the room demanded urgency. Even those who came seeking treatment often remained longer than necessary, allowing warmth to complete its work before returning to the street. The bathhouse encouraged this lingering without instruction. Time moved differently here, shaped by steam rather than by bells or market hours. The building itself supports that change. Stone floors remain warm beneath bare feet. Wooden benches absorb moisture slowly and release it again as the air shifted. Narrow windows admit light without allowing drafts to disturb the interior atmosphere. Everything inside the structure worked together to support the same quiet purpose. Balance returned through many small adjustments at once. Visitors who left carried more than clean skin with them. They carried the feeling that the body had been gently restored to itself. Shoulders settled lower, steps grew steadier. Breath moves more easily through the chest. The warm water had done its job. Yet bathhouses also held another purpose beyond medicine. As the afternoon deepened and steam gathered more thickly beneath the rafters, the bathhouse began to change its character again. Warm water still fills the basins. Herbs still scented the air. But voices slowly became the most noticeable presence in the room. Hana folded a length of linen beside the doorway that led from the changing chamber into the main bathing space. The cloth moved easily through her hands, already softened by many washings. Nearby, two visitors spoke quietly about the condition of a road leading beyond the town gates. Another pair compared the price of grain in neighboring markets. A child laughed once before being gently reminded to walk carefully across the damp floorboards. No one raised their voice. Conversation settled into the room the way steam settled along the beams. Medieval bathhouses were not silent places. They were shared environments where daily life continued in a slower form. People arrived not only to wash, but to meet neighbors they might not otherwise see during busy working days. News traveled here without urgency. Stories passed from one bench to another without needing formal invitation. Warmth encouraged listening. In some towns, visitors brought small food with them to share during longer stays. Bread wrapped in cloth appears beside the benches. Cups of warmed drink rested near the basins. These meals were not elaborated. They belonged to the same rhythm as conversation itself, offered without ceremony and accepted without obligation. Eating became part of resting. Municipal account books preserved from several Central European towns record taxes collected from bathhouse operators, suggesting how common these establishments have become within urban life. They were not unusual additions to a street, they were expected features of it. Their presence supported both hygiene and community in ways that officials considered important enough to regulate carefully. The town depends on them quietly. Sometimes musicians visited during busy evenings, bringing simple instruments that filled the steam-softened air with gentle sound. The music did not interrupt the conversation. It moved beside it, shaping the atmosphere without demanding attention. Visitors listening from the benches allowed the melodies to pass through the room. The warm way passed through their hands and shoulders. Sound became part of comfort. In certain bathhouses, men and women share the same space at particular hours. Though practices varied widely from town to town, some communities arranged separate bathing times, others allowed families to enter together. These differences occasionally led to discussion among religious authorities who worried about maintaining modesty in public places. Yet the bathhouse continued. Records from city councils sometimes describe attempts to guide behavior within these spaces rather than close them entirely. Rules appear about appropriate clothing, visiting hours, or conduct near the basins. Such regulations did not remove the bathhouse from urban life. Instead, they shaped how it remained part of that life. Order supported familiarity. Hannah placed another folded cloth beside a bench where steam drifted upward in slow layers. The doorway behind her framed a narrow view of the street outside, where evening light had begun to fade between the leaning walls of neighboring houses. Inside, however, the warmth remains steady. Visitors lingered longer than they might have elsewhere, allowing conversation to continue without interruption. Time is limited gently here. Children who enter with parents often settle quickly into the quiet rhythm of the room. They watched water move across the surfaces of the basins. They listened to voices that rose and fell without urgency. They learned how to move carefully among benches and buckets, guided more by observation than instruction. The bathhouse became part of memory early in life. Even travelers passing through unfamiliar towns sometimes visited these spaces before continuing their journeys. Steam offered them a brief return to comfort after days spent on rough roads. Conversation offered directions, warnings, and reassurance. For a short time, strangers became neighbors. Warmth made belonging possible. The benches along the walls support more than rest. They supported presence. People sat beside one another without needing introductions. They shared silence when the conversation ended. They allowed the simple fact of being together to remain enough. Community required no announcement. Outside the bathhouse, evening bells might mark the closing of shops or the return of workers to their homes. Inside, those signals arrived softened by steam and distance. Visitors rose gradually from their places when they were ready. No single moment ended their stay. Departure followed comfort rather than schedule. Ahana folded the last of the linen beside the doorway and paused for a moment before carrying it toward the drying racks. Behind her, voices continued in low tones that blended easily with the movement of water across wooden basins. The bathhouse remained full without becoming crowded. Warmth held the room together. And like the Viking house that sheltered families through winter nights, the bathhouse protected people before illness could begin. There were evenings in later years when the benches inside some bathhouses stood empty. Not abandoned, not forgotten. Reading only. Hannah moved slowly across the floor one such evening, her steps quieter than usual in a room that no longer carried the steady murmur of conversation. The basins remain in place. The shelves still held folded linen. Knob bundles of herbs continued to hang from the beams where steam had once gathered in gentle clouds, but the warmth had changed. In many medieval towns, periods of epidemic illness brought new uncertainty to spaces where people usually gathered closely together. Authorities, who once encouraged communal bathing, sometimes began to worry that shared air and shared water might carry unseen danger from one person to another. As fear moved through the streets, regulations followed it. Bathhouses closed their doors, not everywhere, not all at once, but often enough that people began to notice the difference. Municipal records from cities in Italy, France, and the German-speaking regions describe temporary restrictions placed on public bathing during outbreaks of disease. These decisions were not made lightly. Now, officials understood that bathhouses supported cleanliness and comfort, yet they also feared that crowded rooms filled with steam might allow illness to travel quietly between neighbors. Caution replaced routine. In some towns, the benches remain empty only for a season. In others, closures lasted longer. Visitors who had once gathered several evenings each week now stayed closer to home. Washing shifts gradually towards smaller private spaces. Wooden tubs appear more often beside household hearths. Families adapt their habits without entirely abandoning older traditions. Warmth moved indoors. Even so, communal bathing did not disappear everywhere. In parts of Central and Eastern Europe, shared bathhouses continued serving towns and villages long after restrictions appeared elsewhere. The buildings changed slowly to meet new expectations. Visiting hours adjusted, cleaning practices became more careful, yet the central idea remains the same. Warmth could still be shared safely, communities, when chosen to maintain it. Custom endure through adjustment. In these regions, bathhouses remain places where neighbors meet not only to wash, but to exchange news and reassurance during uncertain seasons. Steam continued to gather beneath rafters. Linen continued to pass from attendant to visitor. The rhythm of entry and departure continued much as it had before. The room reminds its purpose. Across the wider landscape of medieval Europe, however, habits gradually shift. As towns grew larger and concerns about disease became more frequent, private washing began to replace some forms of communal bathing. New arrangements appear within households. Separate spaces were built for heating water. Smaller routines took the place of larger gatherings. Comfort did not vanish. It changed shape. Standing beside one of the unused benches, Hannah touched its surface slightly with her hand. The wood still carried warmth from earlier in the day, though no visitors had remained long enough to notice it. The room itself seemed to hold memory the way a longhouse once held along smoke its rafters. Quiet structures remember the people who use them. In this way, bathhouses share something with the Viking houses that had sheltered families through Arctic winters centuries earlier. Both depend not on strength alone, but on thoughtful arrangement. Turf walls held warm inside northern homes. Steam-filled rooms supported health within crowded towns. Neither system required extraordinary effort from those who lived within them. They worked because they were shaped carefully. Throughout the past, people created environments that protected them long before danger arrived. They lowered floors into stable ground. They layered moss between timber seams. They waited patiently through changing seasons before acting. They gathered in shared warmth beside basins of water. Each choice formed part of a larger pattern that allows ordinary life to continue even when the world beyond the doorway remains uncertain. Survival rarely depends on sudden heroism. It depends on preparation. Even when bathhouses closed during difficult years, the memory of their warmth remained. People remember the sound of water moving through wooden basins. They remembered the scent of herbs rising towards ceiling beams. And they remembered conversations that stretched easily across benches without needing urgency or conclusion. Memory carried comfort forward. In quieter villages farther east, where shared bathing traditions continued longer, steam still gathered each evening as it had for generations. Visitors enter with familiar gestures. Attendants prepared linen with practiced hands. Children learned the same careful movements their parents had once followed. Warmth continued its work. Looking back across these places and centuries, a pattern begins to appear. Viking builders shaped houses that lean into the earth instead of resisting winter. Retainers in distant Edo shaped patience into loyalty that endures beyond loss. Riders shaped tournaments into rituals that trained communities as well as warriors. And townspeople shaped bathhouses into spaces where health could be shared rather than guarded alone. None of these systems depend on extraordinary strength. They depended on attention. Like stars moving slowly across a winter sky, these quiet arrangements guided daily life without drawing notice to themselves. People stepped beneath turf roofs, beside steaming basins, into crowded lists and along snow-covered streets without always realizing how carefully their surroundings had been prepared for them. And so the past remains livable not because people endured hardship alone, but because they learned how to live together within it,